In the previous lesson, we explored the ways in which the early church father, St. Augustine, developed this idea of natural law. And we see that we have the natural law theories that begin to come out of the ancient writings of Plato and Aristotle, develop and almost become Christianized by the theologians of the early medieval period. This lesson is going to talk about arguably the most famous of the natural law theorists, and this takes us from the early medieval period to more of the high Middle Ages, looking at the work of St. Thomas Aquinas and looking at how St. Thomas Aquinas is influential in the development of a theory of natural law. So like I said, the previous lesson explored the works of the natural law theory from great Christian church fathers, the main one being, of course, that of St. Augustine of Hippo. We noted that Augustine's theory of natural law essentially situated the concept of God being the creator of something known as the eternal law, and this was representative of a higher law than that of the positive law which was created by man. And so that's how we get an understanding of what Augustine believed in regards to an understanding of the relationship between the positive law and the eternal law, the idea of law that was developed and handed down by God, the law from God, and how essentially the positive law is ultimately subordinate to this eternal law, this higher authority. This lesson is going to examine, like I've mentioned, the influences of Aristotle to the theory of natural law, as well as the ways in which this influenced specifically the writings of the more high Middle Age period from the works of St. Thomas Aquinas. So Aquinas was influenced by Aristotle in a number of different ways. So not only within his theory of natural law, but you also have within his theory of, for example, arguments for the existence of God in Summa Theologica. We see a number of different arguments for the existence of God described as, quote, cosmological arguments, which ultimately have a lot of influence from that of Aristotle and the Aristotelian conception of the prime mover. But that's philosophy of religion. We're talking about jurisprudence. So let's think about St. Thomas Aquinas in a little bit more detail. He was an Italian priest, as well as an influential philosopher, and as well as an influential theologian. He lived between 1225 to 1227. That's when he was roughly around when he was born. We do not have an exact date on that matter. But he died in 1274 and was a major proponent of the movement which became known as scholasticism. Now, his best known work was an unfinished piece of writing known as Summa Theologica, and Summa Theologica does a number of different things, including outlining arguments for the existence of God. We also find a number of his writings pertaining to a theory of natural law and other kinds of theological and philosophical conceptions. So Summa Theologica is a huge piece of writing, by the way. It is quite a hefty set of works, hence why it is unfinished. So he was not able to complete it before he dies. But then specifically when we think about how Thomas Aquinas influences natural law, we will see that the natural law theory of Thomas Aquinas will differ significantly from that of Augustine. And the reason why this is the case, or it is at least argued why it is the case, is because Aquinas would be heavily influenced by the rediscovered works of Aristotle. So while Augustine was writing in the very early Middle Ages, the early medieval period, we note that he did not have access to these old Aristotelian works because, of course, they had not been rediscovered. It was only when Aquinas was writing in around the 1200s that we see that we have these Aristotelian works that had been rediscovered. And the Aristotelian works that had been rediscovered led to ultimately a wave of intellectual conceptions and intellectual ideas from numerous different philosophers and theologians about the concepts that Aristotle talked about. So Aristotle would influence all of these individuals, and he would influence quite significantly the works of Thomas Aquinas. We can see this in the general ways that Thomas Aquinas views and understands the positive law. We can see some of the hints and influences of Aristotle there. So, for example, he argues that the positive law, don't forget the positive law is the law created by mankind, and we delineate this from the eternal law, which is the law created by God, within this kind of theological conception of natural law. He argues that the positive law plays a natural role in political and social life, rather than being simply something which is concerned with the application of commitments to sin, or commitments of sin, which is something that Augustine believed. So Augustine believed that ultimately the positive law was subordinate to that of the eternal law, in such a way that following and adherence to the eternal law, according to Augustine, would mean that the positive law to you had no relevance. And so the result of which is that there is a completely different conception of the way in which law is understood according to Aquinas versus that of Augustine. Aquinas' classical theory of natural law subscribes to something known as the overlap thesis. And what the overlap thesis essentially tells us is that there is some kind of non-conventional relationship that is had between the ideas relating to law and the ideas relating to morality. So a lot of ink has been spent over the hundreds of years, even thousands of years, describing the relationship, the interrelationship between law and morality. Aquinas throws his hat into the debate by talking about this idea of overlap thesis, the idea that there is some kind of non-conventional relationship that exists between the way in which law is and is applied, the nature of law, even the ontology of law, i.e. what law is, what it means to call something law, and the idea of morality. As such, one cannot understand law without some reference to the idea of morality. You cannot escape talking about law from a philosophical perspective, from a jurisprudential perspective, without examination of morality. And having a good, strong foundation of ethical theory is important for a good, solid foundation of your theory of law. Aquinas argues that all human and positive laws which exist ought to be judged by their conformity to the natural law. So what I should remember, and what I should at least highlight to everybody who is watching, is that when we talk about natural law, it is not just a jurisprudential theory. It is not just a theory of law or a theory of the philosophy of law that is limited to law students. Natural law is an ethical theory. It's a theological conception as well. And so as a result of which, you have to view and understand the natural law in that context. So with all this being said, the question that you would want to know the answer to, and the question that is asked throughout this series of lessons, is the ontological question, ultimately. The question of what actually it means to call something law. What is the existence of law itself? And according to Aquinas, the idea of an unjust law is something which only has the appearance of being law. So it has the idea of it being perceived to be law, but that does not necessarily mean that it is law in and of itself. An unjust law in and of itself is not a law, according to Thomas Aquinas. The reason for this is because for him, all law has to adhere to what he describes as the natural law. And what he describes as the natural law is what he describes as just. So, for example, if he says that something does not ascribe to the natural law, then he would argue that it is unjust, therefore it is not law. That is his conception. And so when we ask these ontological questions about the nature of law and what it actually means to suggest that something is a law itself, Aquinas argues that this judgment ought to be made in reference to adherence to this idea of the natural law. In addition to this, Aquinas notes that there exist two foundations from which ultimate reason and the ability to follow the correct course of action can be found. He believes in this idea of the lex divina, the lex divina, and he believes in this idea of the lex naturalis. Essentially, these represent, firstly, the divine law, the lex divina, applicable from biblical revelation. So talking about the revelation from the Bible, essentially, God as revealed through biblical texts. and the natural law, which derives out of rational human observation. These are the two ways in which he understands the foundations for which reason and the ability to follow the natural law can be found. From this, the lex humana, which is sometimes described as the human law, the positive law, is good if it rests upon the foundations of these two further ultimate reasons and foundations for defining what the natural law ultimately is. So long as you have the foundations of the lex divina and the lex naturalis, and you essentially apply the human law, the positive law, to those ultimate conceptions, then you have a good foundation from which law can be described. According to McCoubrey and White, for Aquinas, very clearly a provision of positive law which facilitates or serves a teleological good purpose will be binding upon the consciences of those to whom it is addressed, irrespective of their enforcement by agencies of the state. This is one of the things that I want to finish on, essentially, because we have this idea of teleology within Aquinas' conception of law. And this links very much to the conceptions of teleology that have been described by Aristotle. The link between Aquinas and Aristotle here is particularly strong, because from what we remember from when Aristotle was talking about natural law, we remember that ultimately what Aristotle believed is this idea of teleology of all things, and teleology refers to the idea of a telos, which just means end, and the end purpose, the end result of a particular action or a particular state. And ultimately it gives the view that people will not commit acts which violate the positive law, not because of their fear of punishment and some kind of deterrence, but rather because they are moral and rational creatures and recognize the immorality of the act. So you will not break or violate the law because you are scared of the consequences and the punishment acts as a deterrence. Rather, you will not violate the law because you are a moral creature, and to do so would violate the moral law, the natural law itself.